Hey guys, welcome back to another lesson. Today I'd like to talk to you about a way or a method of understanding complex chords. Now what do I mean by a complex chord? Well, think about something like this G7, flat 9, flat 5, flat 13. My God. So how do you actually make sense of this? Now I'll tell you a little story to start things out. When I started learning piano, I was taught that there were triads, and like they said, let's say this C major, and that I can invert them. And then I use them to play little melodies. Then when I became more advanced, I learned that there are seventh chords, so you can add the seventh degrees of different scales. So, instead of playing a C, I would play a C major 7. So now I would play a C major 7, an A minor 7, a D minor 7, and a G dominant 7. Then I learned that you can take many of these chords, let's say this C, and you can add tensions, also called extensions. And these are higher degrees of the C major scale. So I can add a 9, I can add a 13. There was always an issue with major chords with the 11. Do you add the 11 or the sharpened 11? But either way, there are all these added tensions that I can choose from. So for example, instead of playing a simple G dominant 7, I could play a G9 13th chord. I'll just call this a G 13th chord. Here's a D minor 9 to a G 13th chord. Then I learned that you can take these different degrees and you can lower or raise them. You can, instead of playing, let's say, this G major 9th chord, you can maybe lower the 5th degree. Instead of playing this G dominant 9th chord, you could lower the 9th degree, or maybe even raise it. Or you could lower the 9 and raise the 5th. Now if you add to this the fact that you have different types of chords, you have 12s of each, you can have almost an infinity of inversions and voicings and so on, you end up with a staggering number and amount of chords that you need to memorize and sort of make sense and categorize in some way. And really at this point, I think what most piano players do is they start memorizing, and that's actually a good thing. So, sorry, I'm having tea as I'm recording this to keep my voice, but memorizing is a good thing because being able to play different types of chords quickly makes you a better player, regardless of whether you understand or don't understand them. But nevertheless, it is, I think, almost inevitable that every piano player, every musician asks themselves, well, okay, I have so many chords, how do I make sense of them? And the answer to this is that instead of thinking about chords, you should be thinking about scales. The reason for this, and I'll say this now and it will sound a bit abstract, and it will become clearer as we go along, but the reason for this is that there are far fewer scales that are interesting than there are chords. So what do I mean? Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the G dominant scale. So this would be the scale on which I would construct my G dominant 7th chord, right? I would take the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th degrees. You can also think about this as playing a G major scale, taking the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and flattened 7th degrees. Either way, let's look at this scale. Now, I can do the following in the left hand. In the left hand, I'm always going to play the same thing. I'm either going to play the 3rd and 7th degrees, and maybe add the 1st. Now I might invert it, so I might be playing the 7th and the 3rd degrees, which would be the F and B notes, but that's basically what I'm going to do in the left hand. So most of the time I'm going to play this. 1, 3 and 7, or just 3 and 7, or 7 and 3. Why? Well, just to make life simpler. I'm playing the lower part of the chord, degrees 1, 3, 5, 7, usually omitting the 5, with the left hand. That's the rule I'm going to make for myself. Now, I'm going to start by playing a G major chord. And now, let me start by moving it down this scale. Right? That's pretty straightforward. And you can see that as I move it, I get different chords. Now, not all of them make sense. There might be a bit of clashing, but for example, this would be a simple G7. This would be a G9 sus4, but it clashes with this guy, so I might move it up to get a G9 sus4. This would be a G13th chord, right? I have the G1, 3, 7 here, and I have the 13th degree over here. This would be a G9 chord. So I'm playing a D minor in the right hand, and this bass G7 chord in my left hand. Now, what's the point of this exercise? Well, it lets you sort of group all of these different voicings into one family. And these are all of the possible chords, or most at least, of the chord and chord qualities that fit this G dominant scale. Now, it turns out that you can play other scales that are similar to the dominant scale, starting with G, but there aren't that many of them that produce interesting combinations. One particular scale that produces very interesting combinations is what's called the G diminished altered scale, and it's constructed in the following way. You start with the root, which would be a G in this case, go up semitone, tone, semitone, and then tone, 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 tone. So this is a G altered scale or G diminished altered scale. And now let me show you what can be done with it. So first of all, you'll see that the 1st, 3rd, and 7th degrees of the G dominant 7th chord are part of the scale. The D that you would put in a G7th chord is not. Instead, you get this altered note, which is a sharp 5. However, you might or might not choose to play it in the left hand. That's up to you. But I'm going to keep this basic voicing. And now I'm going to, let's take, let me think for a second how I'd like to do this. Let's start with a G, just like we started previously. And now we start going down this scale. So, I'm going to move. Actually, we cannot start with a G because this D note is not part of this altered scale. Instead, we get the altered, the sharp D. Now we're going to start moving down. So by moving down, I mean moving each note, one note down on the scale. So the E flat would turn into a D flat, G would turn into an F, and B would turn into a B flat. And here's this chord, this G dominant 7, but with a sharp 9 and flat 5. that gives us an interesting sound. Now let's keep on doing this. Let's keep on going down. So this D flat would become a B, this F would become an E flat, and this B flat would become an A flat. Now that's actually kind of the same chord in the sense that it's a G dominant 7, flat 9, sharp 5. Oh, sorry, that's the actually exact opposite. So before we had a sharp 9, flat 5, now we have a flat 9, sharp 5. So the 5 and the 9 are now the sort of the opposite. Before they were sharp, flat, now they're flat, sharp. Now let's keep on going. So we keep on going down, take this B to B flat, E flat to D flat, and this goes to a G. And now we have this G dominant 7, sharp 9, flat 5. Keep on doing this. Take this G down, D flat down, and we get a G dominant 7, flat 9. Now we get, let's keep on doing this, so this goes down, this goes down, this goes down. We get this G7, sharp 9, sharp 5, we can keep on doing this, and so on and so on. So we got a succession of chords, and they are all part of one family. They're all chords built on the G altered scale. Now going back to all of the different combinations, let me play you a little thing, and we're going to stop it, then go back and analyze it. And I'd like to draw your attention to the last chord I played. Right, so it's actually two chords because I have this motion here. Now, previously, before starting our discussion, you'd say, oh, now you're playing a G dominant 7, sharp 5, sharp 9. Now you're moving to a G dominant 7, flat 9, flat 5, flat 13. Well, it's too complicated. What kind of sense can you make of it? Well, the sense that you can make of it is that what I'm doing here is I'm playing something that is a succession of chords and chord motion that are built on the G altered scale. Right? As I've shown you, this chord is part of the G altered scale, and this is as well. Now, this, I think, is a much better way to think about chords and sort of grouping them together and making sense of the different possibilities you have than just memorizing almost an infinite number of combinations. So, it all comes to asking yourself not which tension should I use, and should I raise the 5 or sharpen the 9 or add the 13th or whatever. Instead, what you should be asking yourself almost always is which scale do I want to play, or am I playing, over the current melody. So, are you playing a G altered scale, or just a simple G dominant scale? Well, obviously that's an artistic answer and it's up to you. But once you start thinking that way, I think it simplifies a lot of the process of thinking about chords. Now, the reason this simplifies things is that, as I've said, there are many fewer scales. substantially fewer scales than there are different chord types. In fact, you could argue that for dominant chords, like a G dominant 7, you can really fit, let's say, there are kind of 4 commonly used scales that you'll find a lot in jazz and fusion and popular music. One of them is, as I've said, this dominant scale. The other is this altered scale that we've looked at. Another interesting one, which I'll leave you to play with, is this diminished scale. So diminished scale is built by alternating semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone notes. So starting from a G, you get the semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone. And here's your G diminished scale. There's a variation on it where you do a tone, semitone, tone, semitone. But this particular one actually doesn't fit because it doesn't have the very important third degree. So there's really only one diminished scale that fits dominant chords. And then the fourth scale that gets used every now and then is a dominant Lydian scale. So this would be taking the regular dominant scale and also raising the fourth. So you'll be playing. So doing the same thing. Now it's actually easier to see with your eye, but right? Now it sounds a little bit dissonant, right? It's kind of like a weird, dreamy feel to it almost. But it's actually quite useful, you know? Look at this thing. This is a G9 or G13 with a sharp 11. Here's the sharp 11, by the way, which is the same as the sharp 4. And, you know, have a listen to this. So look at this, I was playing a C major 9, then a B flat 13 sharp 11, going to an A minor 11, and then just other chords. But this thing here, instead of thinking, oh, here's a magical 13 sharp 11 chord, ooh, that came out of nowhere, how could I have thought about this? Well, you should be telling yourself, well, this is not a 13 sharp 11th chord, rather this is a B flat Lydian dominant scale. And that's kind of it for dominant chords. I'm not saying there are of course other scales and other things worth exploring, but if you're sort of looking at the main ones that get used most of the time, I'd say these 4 are it. Things are even simpler for major chords, because for major chords there are only 2 scales that get used. If you think about a C major chord, then one of them is the C major scale. So you'd get maybe, you know, here you can do pretty much any combination of notes. There is what's known as an avoid note on a major scale, which is the 4th degree, kind of the cursed 4th degree. If you're not sure what you're doing, don't play it. But you can see pretty much any other note fits in with a C major chord. You know, just hitting notes almost randomly, making sure to avoid the 4th, which in this case would be the F. The second major scale is the Lydian scale. So here you're raising the 4th. And this would be something like this, just like a major, here's a major 13 sharp 11 chord, right? And again, this has this dreamy quality, and you can get these different combinations. Now, here's another interesting thing that thinking in terms of scales and not chords lets you do. It lets you move around the scale. So, let's say you're playing the C major scale. You have this avoid note, which is the 4th degree, but then instead of memorizing particular fixed forms of chords, you're pretty much thinking about, you can take a shape and you can, maybe try to move it down. Or do anything you want as long as you're not playing this avoid note. The same thing goes for, let's say a simple dominant chord. Right, here's a G dominant 7, and I can say, well, so I'm really playing the same chord, but I'm just taking a shape and moving it down, say, starting from a G. So it's a really interesting and powerful way of thinking about chords. The last chord type that is worth mentioning is a minor chord. Let's say you want to play an A minor. And in this case, you will find a few different combinations. They're pretty much... You could say that you're either playing a natural minor or a melodic minor, which again has an avoid note, which is the 6th degree. It's kind of like, I'm not going to go into theory too much about this, but as before, let's say we're playing an A minor, and you can pretty much play any note and any tension as long as you avoid this F, the 6th degree. Of course, this is not a rule written in stone. You can, of course, add the avoid note, and sometimes it will sound good, sometimes it will add some ambiguity, sometimes it will clash with other things, but you get the idea. So this is what I was trying to walk you through, the idea of thinking in terms of scales and not chords. And this works because there are not a lot of scales you can use, right? For minors, it's pretty much 1, maybe 2. You get a melodic and a natural minor. For majors, it's either a major scale or a Lydian. And for dominant chords, it's either the simple dominant, a dominant Lydian, a diminished, or an altered or diminished altered scale. That's it. I urge you to, take, let's say, a simple progression like this: C major, A minor, D minor, G dominant 7, and write down the scales you want to use for each, and then explore the different possibilities you have for, stick to a simple left-hand voicing, play the third and seventh, maybe the root, and in the right hand, start with, let's say, the bass chord and move it down and see the different interesting combinations you can generate. That's it. I hope you've learned something interesting, and I'll see you next time.